Alright, we are back. And in today's video, we have a very interesting topic that we need to cover, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Because after a very promising start to their season, they currently sit at 8-7, and it just feels like all the hope for this team has just gone out the window. And after a crushing loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where they lost to the score of 30-12 in a game that was a must-win game, we need to talk about the future of this Jacksonville Jaguars team and where they can go moving forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into it. And I think the best way to start is just by talking about Trevor Lawrence in the current season he's having, because honestly, he's kind of taking a step back from last year. Last year in 2022, he had a 66.3 completion percentage with 4,113 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions, whereas this year in 2023, he has a 65.5% completion percentage, 3,736 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. And in his third year, we all expected Trevor Lawrence to take that next big step, and he kind of didn't do that. Now let me get this straight, he's definitely not a bottom 5 quarterback in the NFL. Hell, I'd even argue he's probably in the top 15 range. But we all thought that Trevor Lawrence was going to take that Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes level step, and he just did not do that this year. And whether or not that's his fault is kind of up in the air, but as it sits right now, it hasn't been as good as we want it to be. And I think there's a multitude of reasons as to why he's been kind of struggling. Number one, the offensive line has not been as good as advertised. Number two, they've stopped using Travis Etienne. Number three, injuries in obviously the offensive line and in the receiving room. And number four, the defense just hasn't been great this year. And the way I feel about all that is I kind of feel like that's a lot of excuses to make for one quarterback. Now I understand that those are legitimate reasons, and of course every quarterback might struggle given those circumstances. But again, when you are the number one overall pick and you have high expectations as to what your career is going to be, we expect you to take that next step and to perform even if the circumstances around you aren't the best. This is not a situation where he has Kadarius Toney and Marcus Valdes-Scantling as his number 2 and number 1 receiver. At the end of the day, Trevor Lawrence does have great pieces around him. It's just up to him to maximize his capabilities of what he can do in this offense. And regardless of what the defense and these other pieces around him are doing, all that matters is his performance, and right now it hasn't been up to the standard that we all have for him. And maybe that's not necessarily his fault, more of the fault of the fans and the viewers of what we expect from him to do. Again, what I'm talking about here is the expectations for what he was going to be, maybe being a little bit too high for what he's actually capable of doing. And I think the most recent struggles of Trevor Lawrence have kind of been exemplified by this most recent 4-game losing streak, because on December 4th against the Cincinnati Bengals, he had a great game. He had a 75.9 completion percentage, 258 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and even though they lost, he still had a great game. And not a whole lot of people were really talking about that game because of course they lost, but it wasn't necessarily on him, it was on the defense. Whereas the next week against the Cleveland Browns, he had a pretty mediocre game. He had a 56 completion percentage, 257 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. And I understand that Browns defense is very good, but at the end of the day, you are the franchise quarterback and our expectations of you are pretty high, and that's how you perform. It's not a good look. And then after the Browns game, they went up against the Ravens, and Trevor just kind of had an average game, and then most recently against the Buccaneers, he had another bad game. And that's kind of been the entire season of what Trevor Lawrence has been. He'll have a great game where he looks like the franchise quarterback and one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the entire NFL, and then he'll follow it up with a game where he just looks completely mediocre to downright bad. And I think there's a lot of reasons why. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there have been some pretty large inconsistencies with the offense, whether it's play calling, the run game, the offensive line, or even the defense. Which brings me to my next point. A lot of the players that they expected to progress to stars or really good players have not taken that next step. And there's a couple people on this defense who I think get a lot of the blame. Obviously, Trevon Walker, who was the number 1 overall pick, has just kind of been mediocre. He does have 7 sacks this year, but for a guy who was taken number 1 overall, it's kind of pathetic. K'Lavon Chaisson, who's a guy they were taking a couple years ago back in 2020, has just kind of been a disappointment, and this year he's just basically a backup. And then in the secondary, Tyson Walker and Andre Cisco were both expected to take that next step, but they just haven't done that. And there's a lot of reasons why. I think number one, the biggest reason why is their just expectations were way too high for these players. The players they expected to take that next step haven't taken that next step, and ultimately there's nobody there to really take the step up and replace them. Right now you're basically stuck with Andre Cisco, Tyson Campbell, K'Lavon Chaisson, Trevon Walker, and a multitude of other guys on this defense who you expected to take that next step who haven't because you don't have replacements for them. And that's not necessarily the fault of the Jaguars, because ultimately I do think that those are the guys who you have to make work. It's more of a problem with the coaching staff not developing these guys to be the ultimate player they can end up being. And I think a good example of what I'm talking about here is of course Trevon Walker. At the end of the day, this was a guy with a ton of talent, number 1 overall pick in a very good draft, yet he sits here today and only has 7 sacks and is not that good of a player. And that falls back to the coaching staff not maximizing what he can be, and it also falls back on him as the player not developing himself into becoming that next step player. He was thought to be a project player who could come in and maybe have a couple sacks in the first couple seasons and then eventually become one of the 10 sack premier pass rushers. And maybe he still is on that trajectory, but as of right now, I don't think any of us have really seen what we want to see from him. And I know I'm picking on Trevon Walker here, but it's not just him, it's a multitude of players. Hell, look at Luke Fortner, a 3rd round pick in 2022 who was supposed to be a developmental piece to add along the offensive line, and he just hasn't turned into anything. Now that might be a little bit due to injuries and a couple missed position placements, but you get my point. And then there's Travis Etienne, who actually at the first start of the season was having a great season until recently it hasn't been the same. Since the very first game, he only has one game with over 100 rushing yards, and that came against the Bills on October 8th, where he had 26 carries for 136 yards and 2 touchdowns. And in this most recent 4-game losing streak, his highest amount of carries has been 14 and his highest amount of yards have been 45. And this is supposed to be their premier running back, their featured back, and I get it, it's a league nowadays where you want to have a multitude of guys touch the ball, but this is supposed to be your biggest player on that offense. This is a guy who arguably has the highest upside on this offense, yet they don't use him at all. On the season, he only has 235 attempts for 849 yards and 9 touchdowns. And with the way their season's going, I wouldn't be very surprised if he has less than 1,000 yards on the entire season, which in my opinion is a huge disappointment. And yet again, it's very hard to know if we should blame him as a player or the coaching staff and how they developed him into becoming the featured running back. And I understand that the running back position has completely changed, and nowadays most running backs are used more as pass catchers, but at the end of the day, his potential as a pure running back is through the roof. And sure, him as a pass catcher is pretty solid too, but his season high in terms of catches is 5, and that happened in week 1. Since then, he's consistently getting 3 to 4 pass catches a week. So if you're asking your premier running back to carry the ball less than 15 times and only catch the ball 4 times, how do you expect this guy to get going? This is the guy that should get 90% of the production on the ground game to go along with all the production in terms of pass catching. I understand there's some good running backs behind him and there's a couple guys who have some explosive ability, but this is Travis Etienne we're talking about. The fact that Doug Peterson has Dearness Johnson, Tate Bigsby, and Jamal Agnew taking carries from this guy is just straight ridiculous in my opinion. Etienne at the minimum should be getting 15 plus carries every single week. And in my opinion, if he does that, this offense is going to have a much easier time moving the ball down the field. Take the pressure off Trevor Lawrence by using Travis Etienne in the run game, in the screen game, in the quick dump off game, and I promise you good things are going to happen because he's great with the ball in his hands and he's shifty and he can move and he's fast and everything that you want in a player, he is that guy. And I understand you have some good pieces, guys like Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, and Evan Ingram. I understand. Now I totally understand that Christian Kirk was a pivotal part of this offense and arguably your number 1 receiver, but you still have Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, Travis Etienne, and Evan Ingram. You should be totally fine. At the end of the day, there's too much talent on this offense to just kind of be a mediocre offense. You should be able to beat guys like Jake Browning. Now, as for what I would do for the future of the Jacksonville Jaguars, I think there's a couple of things you can do and a couple of things that you're kind of restricted on. Number 1 thing you're restricted on, you have to pay Trevor Lawrence, you have to pay Travis Etienne, you have to pay guys like Christian Kirk, so on and so forth. Those are going to be the staples of your offense for the next several years. Anton Harrison, Ezra Cleveland, Brandon Sheriff, those are your offensive linemen that you have to make sure pan out to be great players, especially Anton Harrison. Now, defensively speaking, I think the number 1 most important thing this defense has to go through is just development. I also think an influx of secondary talent would definitely help this team out as well. I would love to see this team also get a little bit more athletic on the defensive side of things because you take away Josh Allen, that defensive line is not super athletic. And of course, Trevor Walker's a freak as well, but he has to maximize his athleticism right now. I would love to see this team go out there and either take the best cornerback available or the best linebacker available to really add some fresh legs on this defense. Because while I think their linebackers right now are decent players, I think they're very replaceable. I think you go out there, you get a freak linebacker or a freak secondary member to add to this team, that could completely change the dynamic of this defense. You look at somebody like Nick Bosa, Micah Parsons, Myles Garrett, who may not be the positions that I'm talking about this team needs to get, but completely revolutionize what their defense can do. They need that level of a guy to reach that upside to become what this team needs. I don't know any prospects right now off the top of my head who can come in here and actually fix that problem. I haven't done my full scouting for the upcoming draft. I'll do that probably in the offseason, and I'll probably do a couple mock drafts where I will get this team that guy. But I think right now an athletic playmaker on defense is a desperate need for this team. And I think offensively speaking, you have the pieces to make the offense work. Maybe you need a new offensive coordinator. I don't know. I kind of like Press Taylor. Me personally, I would probably keep him and just focus on developing the guys you have and building a scheme around them. Maybe what you need to do is go out there and get a better quarterback coach, better running back coach, better receiving coaches. But I do think overall your coaching staff should remain the same. Just maybe the assistant coaches need to be kind of shaken up a little bit. I also think bringing in a veteran like an Andy Dalton could definitely help a guy like Trevor Lawrence to also kind of aid in the assistant and development of him as a player. At the end of the day, he is going to be due for a contract very soon, and I promise you guys he's going to get an insane amount of money. Right now, his market value is somewhere around $49.1 million, which is probably what he's going to end up getting. So if you're the Jaguars, you're going to have to make this work somehow. Maximize his rookie contract, find some guys to fix this offense and defense, and get this ship going. Because the rest of the AFC South is catching up. Look at the Texans, look at the Colts, look at the Titans. They got their future quarterback. You got to make sure yours is working. Because if not, it is going to get really bad for the Jaguars and they're going to be the butt of all the jokes in this division. But those are just kind of my two thoughts. Does this team still have the chance to go in there and win a Super Bowl this year? Hey, if they get it together, maybe, who knows? At the end of the day, this is a team that is loaded with talent, like I've said throughout the video. It just kind of has to get their act together. I know us as media like to often overreact to a quick little losing streak, and I do think that might be the case for this one, but I also do think there's definitely some valid reasons to be a little bit overreactive with this. So if you are the Jaguars, if you are the coaching staff and the front office, I think you go to your players, calm them down, and let's focus on the next 2 weeks to get right. If you are the Jaguars, if you go out there and win your next 2 games and just play some really good football and go into the playoffs with a ton of confidence, you might be able to win a couple games, or even, who knows, make it a deep playoff run. I've said this throughout the weeks that this is a pretty weak AFC conference, and right now the Jacksonville Jaguars have a chance to go out there and win a lot of games. I still think this team has a legitimate chance to make a very deep run in the playoffs. We just have to kind of see it happen, so hopefully they can get their act together over the course of the next 2 weeks. The good news for the Jaguars is you have 2 super easy matchups against the Carolina Panthers with Bryce Young and the Tennessee Titans with more than likely no Will Levis. So take these next 2 games to figure out your offense before you get into the playoffs and have to go through a gauntlet of teams. But Jaguars and NFL fans, let me know in the comment section below what you guys think about this current Jacksonville Jaguars team. Do you guys think they can make the playoffs and have a deep run, or do you think they're doomed to be first round exits? And if you did enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it would help me out a ton. We are currently on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so make sure you hit that subscribe button for me. But I love you guys. Peace.